Well, let's talk some more about 1950s culture, much of which revolved around this thing that gained the nickname the Idiot Box, the television. The Idiot Box because people were basically saying that it was going to ruin everybody's mind, that it was far inferior to what you could see in movie theaters, and so forth. As I mentioned, by 1947, 48, they were starting to, we had the three networks that you're familiar with, probably if you're familiar with television: ABC, NBC, and CBS, as well as I think the DuPont network, which didn't last as long as them. And they had original programming. And that original programming is interesting to talk about. So let's take a look at one of the genres, the situation comedy, or the sitcom. Now, that's a specific type of comedy where the humor is in the basic situation of the show rather than being sketch comedy, or rather than being comedy where people are telling jokes. It's all about the situation. Now, when the first sitcoms were aired, the popular ones, the ones that had staying power, they kind of followed a pattern. You may have never heard of either of these shows, The Life of Riley and The Goldbergs, although there was a remake of The Goldbergs just recently. But both these came out in 1948. And they centered on very working class people with very working class problems, very blue collar. The Life of Riley was about this guy on the right there named Riley who works in a factory. So he goes in and punches in and takes his lunch, and it's all about his life at work. And then when he comes home, the Goldbergs was about an Eastern European Jewish immigrant family in the big city. The Honeymooners, one of the most famous sitcoms of the 1950s and one of the best. It ranks up there with I Love Lucy, which everyone seems to be familiar with. But in recent years, I've noticed no one's familiar with the Honeymooners anymore. You should get on YouTube and watch some episodes of the Honeymooners. It's hilarious. The Honeymooners revolved around these two couples, Ralph and Alice Cramden. Ralph is the guy on the far left, and Alice is closest to him, who live in this dinky little apartment in New York City, and Ralph is a bus driver. And then the other couple are their upstairs neighbors and best friends, Ralph and Trixie Norton. So that's the other couple you can see there. Norton works in the sewer. He is a water maintenance guy. So those are pretty, low-level jobs, and the stories kind of reflect around the problems that working-class blue-collar people face. So a lot of the situations that would arise in any of these shows might involve there's layoffs at the factory or layoffs on the job, or there's trouble paying the rent. But around the mid-1950s, things changed on 1950s sitcoms, and you started to see the types of sitcoms that maybe you're more familiar with. For example, I find that most students have heard of or seen episodes of Leave It to Beaver, which is sort of like the very epitome of the type of thing that I'm talking about. Remember how I said just a little bit earlier that in the mid to late 50s, for the first time, the number of white-collar workers outnumbered the blue-collar workers. Well, that started to be reflected on television shows, so that the situation comedies and the families that were in them tended to be white-collar, middle-class families, not working-class, blue-collar families. Shows like Father Knows Best and Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver, and then other shows like Bachelor Father, Make Room for Daddy. All these shows where the husband and father was the patriarch, Whereas, in some of those earlier shows, there was more decision making involved there on the part of the wives a lot of times. And the fathers had these white collar jobs. The dad on Leave It to Beaver, we never even find out what he does. We just know he goes to the office in a suit and tie every day. And that his wife, June, pictured there in the photograph, did all the housework and vacuuming, wearing pearls and high heels. So, in part, this was because the norm, the vision of what the norm in America should be was changing. And also it was in part because the norm actually was changing. Remember, these programs were paid for by commercials, advertisers, advertisements that were promoting consumer goods. And they're going to want to appeal to the largest number of people. And so by the mid-1950s, they were trying to appeal to those white-collar, middle-class people. And the problems were different. The situations that arose in these shows were more like what you might today call first world problems. Like I remember, for example, one time there's an episode of Father Knows Best where one of the kids is in the school play and the other has a music recital. And the big problem is, which one do the parents go to? And then in The Honeymooners, which was on until I think 1956, one episode, the problem was Ralph has to learn self-defense because there's a bully that's been threatening him at the pool room. Well, those are clearly two different worlds. The generation that grew up, the first generation to grow up watching television and having all these modern conveniences and all this stuff, the ones that grew up in the 1950s were part of what's called the baby boom generation. Baby boomers. Okay, boomer. You may be used to thinking of boomers or baby boomers as old people, because now they are, but they weren't always. So these are the kids that were born between 1946 and 1964. That's how it's been periodized. So if you look at the chart there, the baby boomers are in blue. And you'll notice that roughly 1 year after all those soldiers came home, a bunch of babies got born. Well, what does that tell you? For one thing, it tells you that the birth rate had gone way down because so many men were overseas fighting in the war. And it went back up when they all came home. And then kind of kept that momentum going for several years until it started to drop off in the late 50s. So the way this is periodized, the generation before the baby boomers that were born basically in the late 1920s until 1946, sometimes called the greatest generation because they're the ones that lived through the Depression and World War II. The generation that came after the baby boomers between 1964 and 1982 are Generation X, which is my generation. I was born in 1968. They say that Generation X, which is the generation that came of age when they were little kids with Vietnam and Watergate, tend to be the most cynical and sarcastic generation, and I have no idea where they get that. Anyway, so yes, 1982 is the cutoff for Generation X. Then I think 1982 to 1996 are the millennials. And from 1996 forward, Generation Z. And that's most of you guys who are listening to this. Anyway, the baby boom generation, because, like all these different generational groups, they have a lot in common. Because they shared similar experiences, depending on the age group. This is kind of tricky, right? Because I happen to think that me, born in 1968, someone born in 1964 probably has a lot more in common with me than they would someone born in 1948. But they have to cut it off somewhere, I guess. So, baby boomers grew up in the 50s and 60s, and culture was changing in a lot of ways beyond just all the conveniences and the types of entertainment. Part of this change is demonstrated in The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, which was a novel that came out in 1955, made into a movie the next year starring Gregory Peck. And the story centers on a guy named Sloan Wilson, who was a World War II combat veteran who comes back home after the war, traumatized by the terrible things that he had seen and some of the terrible things that he had had to do, and he's trying to get readjusted into society and try to make something of himself. And he becomes a man in a gray flannel suit. And what's significant about that is as he looks around, practically everyone he sees is in a gray flannel suit. They're all dressed the same. He gets a job on Madison Avenue. This is kind of like Mad Men, if you're familiar with that, except it was made during the time that it's portrayed. So he gets a job, as he says, I'll write copy, telling people to eat more cornflakes and smoke more and more cigarettes and buy more refrigerators and automobiles until they explode with happiness. In essence, he gets caught up in what was starting to be referred to as the rat race. And he comes to get caught up in that and sort of realize that's what American society and American culture has become. Everyone looking the same. Everyone obsessed with what they can buy. A couple of nonfiction books that came out in 1950 observed that this is what Cold War American society was turning into. The first one is called White Collar, The American Middle Classes by C. Wright Mills, in which, among other things, he says, quote, bureaucracies have overwhelmed the individual city workers, robbing them of all independent thought and turning them into near robots, oppressed but cheerful. Another book called The Lonely Crowd by David Reisman et al. By the way, if you don't know, et al. Means and others. There were several authors on this. They wrote, quote, Americans are other-directed conformists who lack the inner resources to be truly independent. Lamenting both of these books that Americans really aren't independent anymore. They're all dependent. They're all dependent on becoming almost like robots and everybody conforming. And this is a big part of the Cold War, right? This is a big part of the fact that the Red Scare was on, the House Un-American Activities Committee was on, McCarthyism was starting. So if you stand out as different, you just might be a communist. So you better make sure that you look and talk and think just like everybody else. Now we're going to listen to a song by a band called the Monkees. And the Monkees, they're kind of silly, but they're also kind of awesome. Very 1960s. This song we're going to listen to came out in 1967. Why on earth are we listening to a song that came out in 1967 when we're talking about the early to mid 1950s? Because the guys in this band, who are all in their early 20s around this time, late teens, early 20s, they would have been born like around 1948 or so. That means they're baby boomers. That means that their childhood, their entire childhood, was spent in the 1950s in that very kind of strict conformist, almost restrictive culture where everybody has to fit in or else you're suspect, and everyone is concerned with what things they can buy and what they can watch on television. So when these guys became young adults, around the age many of my students are now, they sang this song that sort of is a reflection of the worldview that they had from having this kind of repressive childhood and how they had basically how they were acting out against it. Okay, so listen closely. I have the lyrics up so you can follow along. Rows of houses that are all the same, and no one seems to care. Another Pleasant Valley Sunday here in Status Symbol Land. And then that last verse, the tune changes completely. The sort of the voice changes. Creature comfort goals, they only numb my soul and make it hard for me to see. So the kids who grow up in the 1950s, when they reach their teens, their mid to late teens, early 20s, in the late 60s, they are going to rebel. They're going to rebel against conformity. They're going to rebel against this strict authority. They're going to rebel against consumerism. And, you know, you can make the argument that they sort of got started down this path earlier when they were 9 or 10 years old, reading Mad Magazine and its very anti-authoritarian approach to things. But they are going to rebel, and it's going to get freaky.